This is to serve as the TFT for Story Stations. It's a 2-hour beginning level face-to-face training. Let's see, a few notes about this one. I bring a list of tier 2 words for groups to use during activity, and tier 1 words, but I just make some training packets. They don't get to have these. Groups just can use these to look at when they're doing their activities, but we do ask for them back. Some people end up working by themselves for this activity, so I tend to try to bring enough for maybe half the group, just in case we need that many. So in this PowerPoint, it kind of goes over the learning objectives first. We're going to help them look at some specific skills of birth to 3-year-old versus 3 to 5-year-olds in order to plan developmentally appropriate activities for children. We actually have an activity that breaks down kind of literacy skills and having them look at when children typically master those skills. We go through a process and help them learn how to create what we are calling story stations in order to kind of pull concepts and interesting items and factors and topics out of books and then put them into each learning area of the classroom. It kind of makes that story come alive. And then they actually get a chance to look at the story station unit that they are going to create and then specifically go back in and look at those tier 1, tier 2 words and see which vocabulary they can purposely push in during their story stations that they maybe wouldn't have thought about at first. So the agenda for the class, we're going to have them do a reflection activity followed by a block party discussion about some quotes regarding early literacy and brain development and things regarding reading. We're going to have them do that skills strips activity, and this is where they're going to look at those specific early literacy skills. We're going to go through a process of how they start planning the stations. They'll get to do kind of a group after we kind of give an example about starting the station. They do a group walkabout to kind of bring that plan to fruition, and then they will get to look at the resource, which is the tier 1, tier 2 word list. Then they get a chance to create their own story stations. And if you have time, share some of them and then include that better vocabulary in their stations at the very end. Obviously, depending on numbers and how many you end up with is going to determine how much sharing can happen. I do always let them know, especially when we're talking about them putting it into practice and doing their own story stations, if they are with a coworker, a co-teacher, somebody from their own age group, that they definitely can work together. If they want to find somebody else and just work together with somebody, that's fine. If they want to work by themselves, it's fine, but they should be able to leave this class with a workable plan for a story station that they literally could use the next week if they had the book at their program. So we want them to take advantage of it and make it purposeful. So the first thing we do is like a reflection activity, kind of like an icebreaker, and we have them complete a puzzle. So this gets tricky sometimes because the puzzles are all in, the ones I have are all in sets of 4 pieces. So you have to play with numbers sometimes. Sometimes I will ask 2 people to share one piece in order to make the groups work. Sometimes I've had some of our staff or somebody that I know fairly well there, and I ask them, hey, can you just sit out for the puzzle piece and then just join a group? Sometimes you have to rig it a little. But basically, and I will upload the book covers on SharePoint for everybody. I just have different pictures of book covers that are cut into different puzzles. So I think I've got 6 or 7 different book covers that I've cut into puzzles. And you may be able to be smarter about it than me and cut some puzzles into some different numbers, which may or may not help do the activity. But sometimes it does take some pre-planning. And as soon as you think you know how it's going to go at the beginning of the class, somebody else walks in. So, but basically, they all have a puzzle piece in front of them, and then they go around the room and try to find the people who have the other pieces of their puzzle that makes their book cover. And then in that group, they introduce themselves, they share their favorite stories or story from childhood that they can remember really being interested in, and talk about the feelings or emotions that surfaced when calling up those stories. So the purpose of this, of course, is to reiterate that most people can remember some types of stories that they liked. Even if they don't remember a specific title, people might remember that they liked mysteries when they were little kids. We get quite a few answers that, oh, I was really into this type of book, and that's why I ended up having something become my hobby. And so we want to make sure that we're reiterating the different books and exposing people to different books with different topics and interests in them can be, those doorways that lead children from simple interests to full-time careers sometimes. Somebody was really into the Babysitter Club books. Maybe they are some of our folks that are in the classrooms these days, which we do hear some of those stories. So we want to make sure that they realize there's a need to expose the children with a wide variety of books, not just books that maybe they're interested in or that is their favorite, because we want to make sure we can spark those interests, and we need to have that wide variety of exposure in order to do that. They do not sit down after the icebreaker. We go right into a block party while they're already standing up. I will put the block party protocol instructions on SharePoint, but basically you're just going to turn on some music, and you do give them the instructions ahead of time. You're going to turn on some music. While the music's on, they're going to walk around the room and find a different group other than the one that they're just in for the icebreaker. Possibly 2 or 3 people. Try to keep them pretty small so they each have a chance to talk. When the music stops, they will find a group, and then you will show a question, and in this case a quote, that they're going to discuss in their groups. So you show the quote, and then they'll get a few minutes to discuss it in their groups. And then when the music starts again, they go around the room again until the music stops, and then they form a different group. And they're going to do this, I believe, for 4 different quotes so that they can discuss them. You don't have them report out their discussions to you or to the group. The point is just for them to be able to express their views to each other. I'm not going to read through these here, but these are the 4 quotes that we use and where they come from in case someone is interested in doing a little more research. A lot of these, of course, are to get them to start talking about the exposure to books and being read to, being linked to different language and literacy opportunities, being linked to brain development in terms of the interactions that we have with other people. And of course, we want to be reading with these children, and the early exposure to language, having that lasting ramifications for language skills. So after the block party, they get to sit back down, and we ask them to get into groups of about 4 to 6 people. I've done this many different ways depending on who comes, depending on, this can be a pretty challenging activity. So I will say there have been times where we've actually done this as a whole group, where I give out the sentence strips to everybody in their groups, and then everybody kind of discusses and votes on where they think it'll go. Basically, I have about 7 sets that I carry with me, and they're just sets of strips of paper. Within these sets, there are 2 headings. One will say birth to 3 accomplishments, and one will say age 3 to 4 accomplishments. So if they're doing them in groups, they basically just take these header strips, and I'm not going to dig for the other one right now, but they would make 2 columns with these header strips of the age groups, and then they go through these specific skills, and they try to decide which age group they think children typically master this skill in. So for example, this one says, knows that it is the print that is read in stories. So the group would decide, well, do we think typical children would master this skill from birth to 3 or between age 3 and 4? And then they would just place it in that column. So you can have them do it in their groups, and they do it that way. Like I said, we've done it as a whole group before, where all the groups kind of, look at the one we're reading out loud, and each group takes a turn choosing one to read out loud. And then the class as a whole decides or kind of votes on where they think it belongs, which sparks some really good discussion sometimes. We've done it as a race before. it doesn't really matter how you do it. We just want them to start looking at these things and realizing that all of these different literacy skills go into, our developmentally appropriate practice is what we want them to start looking at. A lot of times, a lot of things that end up in the birth to 3 category, it goes both ways. They think that maybe they don't know how to do that until they're 4. And then we have things that are in the age 3 to 4 that we see people are really, really focusing on 1-year-olds trying to do. So we want to try to get them to learn that there is an appropriate place for these different skills, which build all together those reading and literacy skills. I do have some answer keys. So sometimes if we do it as a group and the group are telling people where to place the skill, I'll have somebody that owns that key and they get to make corrections. Or if they're doing it in groups, you can ask them to try to complete it first, and then you can give them an answer key and have them check their own answers to see how well they did. Sometimes we don't get through them all. Sometimes it does take a while. And we have about 15 minutes allotted for the activity. So if you have a really, really large group, you may want to just let them know ahead of time that we may not be able to get through them all, but at least it gives them some exposure. And then we do encourage them to either take a picture of the answer key that we give them, because those are nice and neat on the columns, the answers there, or take a picture once they get them, the strips in a row on their tables. They could take a picture of that and take that with them. So then we kind of switch to what we call starting the stations. And so this is kind of an interactive demonstration about how we're going to begin creating this story station. And we kind of just want to reiterate again that the purpose is to take one book and make it kind of stretch into all different learning areas in the classroom. So it's not just a one and done thing where they're hearing this story, they never come back to it again. We want to let them know there's a million things we can pull out of books that can aid in learning and be, switched over and tried to figure out creatively how to get math into it, science into it, any area of the classroom based on this one book that hopefully they're interested in. So that would spark their interest in that learning in that area. So I have my own little collection. Sometimes I go to the library, but I typically bring about 20 to 30 books with me for the class. And I have them all just set up, standing up either around the room or on a specific table. And the first part of this is I typically ask for a volunteer who likes to read stories to choose a book and read it to the class. Preferably not a long one, because we are really just trying to model the whole process of creating a story station right now. So I usually ask someone to not pick the longest book up there. And I will say I always have to tell them, we just want you to read the story and show us the pictures. You don't have to pretend you're reading for a group of kids. People get really hung up and they think we're observing or assessing how they're reading this book. And we're not in this case. We just need them to read the book and let the participants at least see the pictures. So once they read the story, then I usually just pass the book around the room while we have the next part of the discussion. And I bring a hat that kind of looks like a kid's construction hat with me, and then another hat that's more of an adult hat. And so what I tell them is that, step one is choosing the story, reading the story. And of course, we hope that you picked the story because of something in your class or your children that you thought they might be interested in, not just a willy-nilly random story. There should be a tie-in from their interest. So you're going to read the story, and then we're going to put on our kids' hat. So I physically put on that kid's hat during the class, and I ask the participants to do the same thing and ask them to put on their kid's hat for a minute and think like the children would think. So then I take a piece of chart paper and we're asking them, I usually put the title interested on the top, or interesting. And then I ask people to call out things that they saw in the book that the children would be interested in, or it would get the children's attention if they had just read the book. So typically these are objects, people, could be specific words or things that were said during the reading, could be places or pictures, something in the pictures, something in the colors. We do ask them not to think too deeply about it. It's kind of what is jumping out. And even ask them to consider nonverbal children, just kind of what do they think they would be drawn to, point to those types of things if they were read the book. So those are all going under the heading of interesting on one chart paper. The next step is to take off the kid's hat and put on our teacher's hat, which I specifically do. And now we're going to fill out another chart paper that says learning opportunities, skills, or concepts. And so with their teacher's hats on, we ask them to call out things that could be that are related to that first list of what was interesting. That could be learning opportunities, skills, or concepts, or topics that we can talk about. So at this point, we don't want specific games, activities, plans, or things like that. We just want more topics, realms, concepts. So for example, if there was a bear in a cave in the book and that was listed on the interesting part, this chart might say bears, habitats, animal houses, what do animals eat, things like that. If someone is considering the younger age group, it might just say animals. It might say colors. It might be just at a different level, depending on which age group we're talking to. If the books had numbers and objects in it, sometimes the numbers themselves are going to be said. Sometimes if people are working with older children, a teacher might say one-to-one correspondence. Just really depends on the book that your class chooses to read. But these are the things that we want to pull out and what is interesting. So now we know what is interesting for the children. We as the teachers, of course, how do we make what's interesting into these different learning experiences? So the next step is to get another piece of chart paper, and we're going to label this one environmental enhancements to consider. Sometimes I just write environment. And so we want to ask them to shout out some things that could possibly be done to the environment to kind of bring this story to life. So again, with the bear in the cave example, could you make your cozy area into a cave? If you, let's see, the wooden stove that they have in the room, could they turn that into a store counter if you're talking about a book that had a store in it, things like that. So what could they be done to the environment, and including outside, that can really just liven up the story stations. And then the last piece is looking at the specific learning areas or learning centers in their room or developmental areas they want to consider in their planning. So I have them shout out some of their typical learning centers in the room. We do not cover all of them. Usually I stop it by 7 or 8. And we ask, I usually ask for a volunteer for this part to help. As they call them out, we write the name of that learning center area on the top of a piece of chart paper. And these we hang up around the room. And there are examples in the training application. So once we have these areas, we're still not asking them for ideas yet. We're just asking them for the areas that they would happen in. Once those are hung around the room, then they get to get up and participate in a walkabout and share their ideas. So this is where then someone might go over to the math area and come up with an activity, or whether it's teacher directed or just something for the children to explore, an opportunity in the math area that then would tie what was interesting into a concept that we were going to develop and put it in that math area. And I let them do this by themselves, or they can walk around with a partner, but I really challenge them to contribute at least 3 ideas, depending on how many different areas you have hung up in the room. So when they're done, we don't read through all of these because they can all read. We just ask them to look at how many ideas and activities were just generated out of one story. If we end up with a chart paper or a specific area that doesn't have any ideas listed, then I will come back and challenge people to come up with that one and maybe give some examples ourselves. Okay, then they're going to get, I don't think I have a picture on here. Okay, stop sharing this for a second. They're going to get this handout. Actually, they're not going to get this handout. Going to get this handout. I don't know why it will not pull up. Okay, well, they're going to get a handout that looks like this. There we go. And it's a concept diagram example. And this is kind of just the planning form that we use when we're planning the station. So this is an example of one based off of the book Jamberry. And so this just kind of shows different activities and or materials, opportunities for exploration that are put in different areas. This one just has 5 on there because we're just kind of trying to show the example. So they get that example, and then they are going to end up getting a blank one of those with a few more areas to use as a template for today. And then I usually bring extras in case people want to use one back in their program. They can also take a picture of the blank one and make their own copies. So then we take a few minutes before they start actually doing their own stations to talk about how we can use different books for different age groups. So how sometimes, going back to that first quote, sometimes age ranges that are suggested are pretty wide and they could be a little bit deceiving. So how can we use picture books for older children in creative ways? How could books that we would typically think are for older children be used for younger children? And then how do the story stations themselves look different for different age groups and how they look the same? And this is just giving them a few minutes at their tables. Looks like 3 minutes per question to just kind of discuss these things at their table, to think about this before they start planning their own stations. So now they get to put it into practice and they do their own stations. So again, they can get in their own groups, they can work with a partner, they can work by themselves. We really do want this. I mean, this can be a transfer of learning plan automatically because they can use this station in their classroom if they make it work for them. So we encourage them to just make sure that happens regardless of who they're working with. So what we ask them to do is literally go through the same steps that we demonstrated. So they don't just get to take that template and start writing down activity ideas. We ask them to use the back of the template, which is blank, to go through every step that we did on those chart papers. So each group is going to choose a story that we brought. They're going to read the story. They're going to make a heading on the back that says interesting. They're going to put their kids' hats on, list some things that are interesting. They're going to make another heading that says concepts or topics or interests that we want to develop. They're going to make a list of those ideas. They can skip the part about putting down the learning centers, but then we do want them to include the environmental considerations or enhancements. And only when they get through all those steps, then they can turn the paper back over to the diagram and start filling out the specific activities. They've got, 30 minutes to do this. So if groups get done early, that might determine how many get to share. You could also ask each group to share one activity, or you could also prompt it by saying someone share something that you plan for the math area, things like that. Then we get to go back for this final piece, and we want to, again, mention this vocabulary that we have an opportunity to push in and pull out during these story stations. So then we give them the Tier 1 and Tier 2 word list, which they have now planned their story stations without. and ask them to go back and choose some to push in. So we do, for people who are not familiar with them yet, we have a slide that just kind of goes over the basic meaning of the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 words. And there are some examples on here. This was taken right from the Cox Campus resource on these different tier words. But each group will have that resource training packet to look at. So then we ask them to go back and pick out 3 to 5 appropriate words that they would push in for the children during the time they're focused on the story. They don't have to list them in a specific area. They can put this on the back with their pre-brainstorming plans, but just as thinking of the story that they chose as a whole and the activities that are going to be happening while they're doing the story stations, picking 3 to 5 words that they could push in that relate to what they're doing. So, and then for the closing moves, we just, any final questions that they have, we go back and review the objectives for the class, and then, of course, fill out the evaluations. And this still says certificates, which I will fix as soon as we hang up. Obviously, they will get their certificates from the PDS. And that's for story stations. Thank you.